This is a response to LogosApologia's Resurrection Challenge video, and although I know winners have already been named, I still wish to offer my critique to the points in the video. I'd like to begin by making a prediction. Because the resurrection is supernatural and supernatural events cannot be verified, and because it is an historical claim and historical events cannot be falsified, LogosApologia will present alleged evidence that can only go so far to demonstrate the belief of early Christians that Christ rose from the dead. There will be no direct evidence for the resurrection itself, only second-hand accounts and hearsay, not even eyewitness testimony. This will create a huge problem for Logos, because if his evidence does not support the resurrection, then there is not even a need to account for it in his challenge. However, I'll take things a step further and show that, even supposing all 5 of his facts to be true, resurrection is not the most probable or justified explanation, and there is an alternative natural explanation available. The first fact we are presented with is that Jesus really died on the cross. Logos states that all 4 Gospels agree on this, as well as 5 extra-biblical sources. He includes the Talmud and Marabar Serapion in the latter, although the Talmud passage only mentions someone who was hung on a tree after having been stoned to death. There is no reference to crucifixion, and the Marabar Serapion passage merely talks of a wise king the Jews killed. The truth is that Gospels and external sources together, none of these accounts come any sooner than 40 to 50 years after Jesus supposedly died, and even if the fact of his death is necessary for resurrection, this fact alone does not in any way add to the case for the resurrection. It's more of a criterion that apologists must meet than one skeptics must answer for. What Logos actually presents are 4 facts, not 5. The second fact is that the disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead. As Logos explains, people don't die for something they know to be false. While this may be true, it hinges on the part about knowing something to be false. If the disciples were deceived about the resurrection, would they have known it? People die for lies all the time, but they don't always recognize them as lies even when disconfirming evidence passes right in front of their faces. The Watchtower Society, or the Church of Jehovah's Witnesses, has made at least 3 major predictions of the end of the world that have failed, and yet followers still rationalize and explain away these errors, rather than face the fact that their church was wrong in its predictions. Unless Logos has some indisputable evidence that the disciples lied, fully knew they had lied, and continued to preach the lie even to torture and death, this fact accounts for nothing except the possibility that the disciples firmly believed in the resurrection, and the conviction with which one holds a belief does not tell us anything about whether or not that belief is true. To make one additional and minor point, I'd like to discuss the so-called early Christian creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 that Logos mentions. The creed has a couple inconsistencies with the Gospels, in that it omits Peter from the 12, and at the time of the post-mortem appearances, there were only 11 disciples, since Judas had died before the resurrection and Matthias had not replaced him until after the ascension. These details, combined with the fact that no early Christian literature ever names the 1 Corinthians passage as a creed, cast quite a bit of doubt on the assumed antiquity of it. The third fact, according to Logos, is that Paul changed from being a persecutor of Christians to a believer willing to die for the faith. Yet again, even if this much is true, it only demonstrates the sincerity of belief held by Paul, not that the resurrection was an historical fact. It's difficult to tell how much of Paul's story is an accurate representation, if any of it is, because Paul was known to change his tune when it would suit his needs. He says in 1 Corinthians 9:20, "To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so to win those under the law." For Paul, it's all about winning at any cost. Acts is widely considered to be written by the same person who authored Luke, and if this is the case, then the portrait of Paul in Acts is written by a close friend of Paul, which is not unbiased to say the least. In Acts 21, when Paul is arrested and taken before a mob of angry Jews, he delivers another "I am a Jew" speech. When the mob grows unruly, Paul is taken back to the barracks with a Roman commander and Roman soldiers, where he delivers a new speech, not surprisingly declaring himself a Roman. Then when the commander takes Paul before the Sanhedrin, Paul whips out yet another speech, claiming to be a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. In short, why trust the backstory for Paul that is given in the Bible? There is no independent confirmation of it, and even if true, none of this provides evidence for the resurrection, only for Paul's belief in it. The fourth fact presented by Logos is that the skeptic James was converted. What's with all these conversion stories, though? None of them tell us anything about the factual reality or falsity of the resurrection, so why do they seem so impressive to apologists like Logos? Not to be crude, but what guarantee does he have that these men weren't just gullible dimwits? We are talking about the first century after all, long before things like stage magic or science were even understood. What would it really take to persuade someone back then that another person had risen from the dead? Additionally, scholars like Robert Eisenman have suggested that the verses indicating disbelief from Jesus' family are overwrites intended to smear the image of James and the other brothers of Jesus, who were not well liked by Paul and his crew, insultingly labeling them as super-apostles and weak in faith. For the sake of time, I won't go into more detail on this, but the case for these suspected overwrites is convincingly made in Eisenman's book, James, the Brother of Jesus. Suffice it to say that James may not have been a skeptic at all. Last of all, the empty tomb is presented as fact number 5. This seems to be a very popular inclusion among apologetic arguments for the resurrection, but it encounters a major flaw in the much more established fact that, well, we still don't have Jesus' tomb. What Logos and other apologists refer to is rather the empty tomb narrative, yet this is rarely clarified. Obviously, a story is not quite as trustworthy as hard archaeological evidence, and the earliest accounts of the resurrection in Paul's writings contain no mention of an empty tomb at all. This puts resurrection proponents in a very uncomfortable situation, especially when they're making claims about how the Romans could have simply exhumed Jesus' body to disprove Christianity right then and there. However, not only is there no empty tomb in the earliest sources, but as Acts 2 states, the disciples did not start preaching the risen Christ until Pentecost, 7 weeks after Jesus' ascension. With this much time passing before the disciples began to witness, identifying the remains of Jesus would have been practically impossible. Some may note that simply finding a corpse in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb should have been enough, but as already pointed out, there are many historical examples of people continuing to believe, even when disconfirming evidence is shown to them. There is also a good possibility of legendary invention behind the Joseph of Arimathea tomb story, too. Joseph was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin according to Luke 23:50 and Mark 15:43. It's hard to believe that a member of the court that allegedly sentenced Jesus to death for blasphemy would later convert and provide his family tomb to bury him in out of respect. Mark's Gospel does tell us that the whole Sanhedrin was looking to convict Jesus, and that they all condemned him to death, so Joseph would had to have been among those who voted for execution. Additionally puzzling is why the Sanhedrin would have been allowed to make use of a Roman execution method for blasphemy charges, when their usual punishment for such an offense was stoning, followed by hanging after death. Nonetheless, the typical burial for crucifixion victims was in a mass grave, but because the Sabbath was approaching and the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb in accordance with Jewish burial customs. Interestingly, these passages don't really say Joseph buried Jesus out of admiration, but more that he buried him in observance of Hebrew law. For a member of the Jewish high court, this would not be at all surprising. This brings me to the natural explanation for the resurrection accounts that I spoke of earlier. If we assume that the Christianization of Joseph is legendary invention or interpolation, we have the possibility of a burial out of Sabbath observance and a relocation after the Sabbath. In other words, Joseph could have buried Jesus out of respect for Jewish customs, and once the Sabbath passed, he relocated the body to a mass grave, once again keeping with those customs. Because the Gospels report that Mary Magdalene and other women witnessed Joseph bury the body of Jesus, and these same women were purportedly the first to find the empty tomb, it could be that the body had been moved by this point, without the knowledge of the women or the disciples. Note the first reaction of the women in John's Gospel when telling the disciples of their discovery. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Once again, if Jesus had been relocated to a mass grave after the Sabbath, the Romans digging up the corpse from a mass grave after 7 weeks of decomposition in order to disprove the ravings of a small sect would not just have been a waste of time, it would have been virtually impossible too. This explanation resolves all the so-called facts proposed by LogosApologia and many of the apologists making similar claims that I have encountered thus far. It accounts for the death on the cross, it accounts for the disciples continuing to believe, having actually found no body in the tomb, it accounts for the belief of Paul and James, and it accounts for the empty tomb narrative as well. No unverifiable appeals to the supernatural are made, meaning that everything complies with known evidence about the reality and operation of our world, and it also fits well within the historical context of the time and the cultural customs of first-century Jews. The explanatory power and scope of this hypothesis is far greater than the resurrection proposal for these numerous reasons. As we see, not only is the resurrection challenge built on faulty assumptions that cannot get us to a resurrection at all, but there is even a natural explanation available that accounts quite well for every supposed criterion in the challenge. Thanks for watching.